You may know already that the Conference of Parties that are held every year continue to negotiate various aspects of climate finance, like loss and damage, uh, every year, and it keeps struggling. There is some form of climate finance in place, and it has an amount that is, constantly being considered insufficient, and even the promises made for 2035 levels are considered insufficient. So, climate finance is meant to help low income countries adapt to climate change and recover from disasters. And Hurricane Melissa is a good example that we'll look at in a minute. How climate finance to help poor countries became a global shell game. Donors have counted fossil fuel projects, airports, and even ice cream shops as part of the funded projects. That's a bloody disaster. When Hurricane Melissa tore through the Caribbean in October, it left trails of destruction, and Jamaica was recovering from Hurricane Beryl the year before and got crippled again. And the main point is that the damage here has been estimated at 6 billion to 7 billion. The country has Jamaica has a disaster risk plan, which is designed to help it quickly raise several $100 million when there is a disaster. But the damage from Melissa obviously far exceeds that plan. Whether Caribbean nations can recover from Melissa's destruction and adapt to future climate change risks without taking on debilitating debt will depend in part on the big global promise, climate finance. There's a nice video on what Melissa did that you can look at on YouTube. The video shows Category 5 Hurricane Melissa's damage across Jamaica. Developed countries that grew wealthy from burning fossil fuels, the leading driver of climate change, have pledged billions of dollars a year to help ecologically vulnerable nations like Jamaica, Cuba, and the Philippines, recently hit by a typhoon, adapt to rising seas and stronger storms, and rebuild after disasters worsened by climate change. In 2024, they committed to boost climate finance from 100 billion a year to at least 300 billion a year by 2035, and to work towards 1.3 trillion annually from a wide spectrum of public and private sources. Obviously, the stories so far don't look very promising for such goals, but nonetheless, we have to keep trying. Here is Hurricane Melissa, which killed more than 90 people across the Caribbean in October 2025 and caused billions of dollars in damage, including in Cuba. So, if the world is pouring billions into climate finance, why are developing countries still struggling with recovery costs? Uh, Grants versus loans, debt traps are always very different. So, we have to be careful how the climate finance is provided and whether development projects like airports and even fossil fuel projects are being counted as adaptation finance. So, there's always this issue we have discussed elsewhere. The author says he studies the dynamics of global environmental and climate politics, including the UN's climate negotiations, and the lab has been following the climate money. Governments at the UN Climate Conference in Brazil, COP30, have been negotiating a plan to get closer to 1.3 trillion per year by 2035 and make it easier for developing countries to access the funds. But the world's climate finance so far has rested on a shaky foundation of fuzzy accounting, one where funding for airports, hotels, and even ice cream stores is being counted as climate finance. So, obviously, complete cooking of the books. So, cooking the climate finance books then. Wealthy nations first promised in 2009 to raise 100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries by 2020. Whether they hit that target in 2022, as claimed, is up for debate. So even that part cannot be verified independently and honestly. Transparency is an issue. Researchers have found many cases where the reported numbers were inflated, largely due to largely due to relabeling of general aid that was already provided and calling it climate aid. As I said, development finance was being renamed climate aid, so there's double counting or just fuzzy logic. United Kingdom, for example, claims it's on track to meet its £11.6 billion or $15.2 billion pledge, but it's doing so in part by reclassifying existing humanitarian and development aid as climate finance. So they're not adding new money, they're just relabeling what was already committed in another label. This practice undermines the principle of additionality, the idea that climate finance should represent new and additional resources. An analysis by Climate News site Carbon Brief, an analysis by the Climate News site Carbon Brief, which is another very reliable source, suggests that to truly meet its target, UK would need to provide 78% more than it currently does. How do you actually make a country pay other than relying on its historical sins of emitting fossil fuels, which accumulate, carbon accumulates. So now you are responsible for all these damages, so you have to pay. That's the logic. But there is no, is it a legal basis? Can you hold the countries responsible? The UK's creative account is not a one-off. The Centre for Global Development estimates that at least 1/3 of the new public climate finance funds in 2022 actually came from the existing aid budget. In some cases, money had just been shifted around and relabeled as climate finance. Sources of climate finance for developing countries, then loans, grants, and other aids that wealthy countries either provided or mobilized from the private sector to help developing countries adapt to climate change passed 100 billion in 2022, according to OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Most came from public funds, with much of it distributed through multilateral institutions like the World Bank, so bilateral public, multilateral public, export credits, and private. So not always cash aid, but in-kind aid, right? So you have the numbers here going. 2015 was missing some data, so 14 to 2022, you can see the multilateral and bilateral public funding dominates, with some private funding as well. It doesn't matter if it's successful in helping developing countries adapt and prepare for future risks, but is that really happening? What's counted as climate finance comes from a mix of sources and is predominantly provided through loans and grants. Some funding is bilateral, flowing directly from one country to another, not from a global pool. Some is multilateral and distributed through organizations such as the World Bank or the Green Climate Fund that are funded by the world's governments. Money from private investors and corporations can also count in this growing but fragmented system, so it's not well organized as such. Countries providing the assistance have been able to stretch the definition of climate finance, and this leads to relabeling and counting any project as a climate climate finance project. Fossil fuels, hotels, and ice cream stores come in this into this story here. When it comes to climate finance, the devil is in the project details. Nice report may be provided with glossy brochures, but how actually the counting was done can be looked at here. Take Japan, for example. In 2020, its state-backed Japan Bank for International Cooperation used an environmental fund to finance a 1,200 megawatt coal plant in central Vietnam. Is that adaptation? In some sense it is. You are providing energy, but it's counter to the climate action of climate mitigation, emissions reductions, net zero, etc. That power plant will emit far more air pollution than Japan would allow for a power plant within its own borders. The same bank labeled an airport expansion in Egypt as eco-friendly because it included solar panels and LED lights. So here you are. Japan counted funding of Egypt's Alexandria International Airports as a climate project. In some cases, these projects increase greenhouse gas emissions rather than lowering them. So maybe there is a stricter definition needed to say what is climate adaptation versus what also counts for emissions reduction. You can do climate adaptation without worrying about mitigation. It will just increase the challenge of mitigation if we keep doing this because emissions keep going up, right? For instance, Japan funded an airport expansion in Papua New Guinea that it labeled as climate finance because it was expected to reduce fuel use. However, an analysis by the International Council on Clean Transportation used in Reuters analysis found that if the airport meets passenger targets in its first 3 years, emissions from the outbound flights will rise by an estimated 90% over 2013 levels. So Italy also claimed 4.7 million as climate finance for helping a chocolate and ice cream company expand into Asia. So they are maybe extending their own business, investing in that, and then labeling it as a climate finance. How fancy is that? US counted a 19.5 million Marriott hotel development in Haiti as climate finance because the hotel project included stormwater control and hurricane protection measures. Fantastic bookkeeping, right? Fossil fuel subsidies far exceeded climate finance. This always happens. So 2010 to 2022, climate finance commitments have inched up a little bit, but you can see they barely crossed 50 billion. The fancy bookkeeping gave us 100 billion in 2022, but you can see that fossil fuel subsidies have shot up over 450 billion by 2022. This may be a post-COVID stimulus funds for recovering economies. So an analysis by One Data puts climate finance in perspective. The world's high-income countries spent far more subsidizing fossil fuels, the leading driver of climate change, than they committed to help low-income countries adapt to climate change and recover from storm damage. Obviously, there is some element of altruism when we want climate finance as just adaptation funds, grants, especially for poor countries, developing countries, even if it's a loan. There are always debt risks and debt default risks, so which countries may be worried about that anyway. So these are not isolated examples. Reuters reviewed climate finance documents it received from 27 countries and found that at least 3 billion labeled as climate finance went to projects that had little or nothing to do with fighting or recovering from climate change. That included movie financing, coal plant construction, and crime prevention programs. For many of these projects, the money comes in the form of loans, which means the developed countries that provided the loan will make money off the interest. It's also responsibility of the countries that are taking these loans, which may be signing off on development and other societal projects as under climate finance because they need the money and they have no choice. Why fixing climate finance matters? A central test for success of international climate talks will be whether governments can finally agree on a shared definition of climate finance, one that protects the interests of vulnerable countries and avoids creating long-term debt. Without that clear definition, donor countries can continue to count marginal or loosely related investments as climate finance. There are plenty of examples that show how targeted climate finance can help vulnerable countries cut emissions, adapt to rising risks, and recover from climate-driven disasters. It has helped save lives in Bangladesh with early warning systems and storm shelters and improved crop resistance to worsening droughts in Kenya, among other projects. But when governments and banks count existing development projects and fossil fuel upgrades as climate investments, the result is an illusion of progress while developing countries face worsening climate risks. At the same time, wealthy countries are still spending hundreds of billions of dollars on fossil fuel subsidies, which further drive climate change. Basically, rich countries consider themselves somewhat immune to climate impacts, but this is not true. All the rich countries are also getting hit with heat waves, wildfires, floods. So when we will wake up to climate risks, it's not clear. For countries from Jamaica to Bangladesh to Maldives, the threats from climate change are existential. Every misreported or creatively counted climate finance dollar means slower recovery, lost livelihoods, and longer waits for clean water and electricity after the next storm. So really kind of sobering article, and how we will get past this is not always clear, but the negotiations keep going on and developing countries keep getting hammered. So they will be struggling with just managing crisis after crisis like Hurricane Melissa, and then they will hardly have any resources to build resilience to mitigate the future risks. So we are in a trap that we must get out of. Okay.